Welcome to episode 330 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Todd Schliem, who served in the FBI for over 22 years. In this episode, he reviews his investigation of violent gang members of the Harvey Hustlers and its enforcement arm, the Murder Squad. They were responsible for multiple killings associated with illegal drug sales in the New Orleans area and ruled the streets of Harvey, Louisiana for nearly 30 years. David Williams, aka Mr. Harvey, and his brother Rob led the Harvey Hustlers. Brothers Melvin and Jerome Hudson led the Murder Squad. As they got rid of their rivals, they eventually turned on each other. Most members ended up dead or in prison. The multi-agency case was codenamed Operation Swag Crazy. Todd says his proudest accomplishment in this case is knowing that it improved the quality of life in the neighborhoods previously held hostage by these ruthless gangs. Todd's first office was a two-man South Lake Tahoe resident agency out of the Sacramento division. During the 5 years he was there, he was involved in the investigation of 2 horrific child abduction murder cases. After the tragic 9/11 terror attacks, Todd volunteered for TDYs to Saudi Arabia and Guantanamo Bay, where he interviewed Taliban and Al-Qaeda prisoners. Upon his return, he transferred to the San Francisco division, where he was assigned to the OSADEF squad, was a member of SWAT, and a certified crisis hostage negotiator. He and his wife, an agent who was in his FBI Academy class at Quantico, relocated to the New Orleans division to be closer to family. Todd landed on the drug squad, where he was the recipient of numerous awards, including the FBI Director's Award for Outstanding Criminal Investigation, the Safe Streets Top 30 Gang Investigations, and the Federal Services Executive Board Case of the Year, among others. Towards the end of his career, Todd attended polygraph school and served as the New Orleans Division's polygrapher. The Special Operations Surveillance Group, SOG, was his last assignment before his retirement. Currently, Todd Schliem is the chief of police for his adopted hometown of Mandeville, Louisiana, where he leads a department of nearly 60 sworn officers and administrative employees. Now, before we get to the episode, I want to let you know that whenever possible, I will continue to post more than 2 episodes a month. There is no set plan for when that extra episode pops up during the month. So what I'm saying is, to make sure that you don't miss an episode, please hit the follow button for FBI Retired Case File Review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you live in Barcelona, Madrid, or Lisbon, email me and maybe I'll bring you over some podcast stickers and buttons when I travel to Spain and Portugal next month. Also check your inbox, spam filter, and promotions tab for my September email to Reader Team members. I created a chart for the top FBI TV series to date and talk about the upcoming new FBI shows for 2025. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to join my reader team where I talk about crime fiction, and you can learn more about the FBI and books, TV, and movies. Buy me a cup of coffee, discover my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Todd Schliem. Hey, Todd, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on today, Jerry.
Or should I call you Chief?
No, we'll wait for that. For me or my friends, it's Todd, and for my kids, it's Dad or Dad. Yeah.
I know all about that. I am so excited to get you on the podcast. We have been working towards this for a while. Our schedules finally have met up, and it's kind of timely because I saw that the FBI in Louisiana has been doing this Operation Clean House. I think that's what it was called. What they're trying to do is to target some of the violent individuals in New Orleans and throughout Louisiana. This is about, I guess, 10 years after you were actively involved in similar activity.
Yeah, I think the Bureau's program, we're in Louisiana, South Louisiana, in New Orleans. If you're looking for violent crime, there's no shortage of it in Louisiana. So I think any program the FBI tries to establish now, it can only help.
When we first communicated about what case that you would review on the podcast, and you told me about the Harvey Hustlers, of course, I did a quick Google search and came up with all of this information about the gang and about the gang members. So I know we're going to have a lot to cover today.
To cover this whole thing in the scope of 2-3 hours, if you're looking at the Hollywood version, it'd be a mini series. My analogy that I like to use is this: if you look at General Motors, tell me about General Motors. Well, then I'd say, do you want to talk about Pontiac, Chevrolet, Cadillac? And the list goes on down the line. But this case was a true career case. Certainly the most violent group I had ever encountered. And that's to say a lot in the New Orleans area. In my almost 25 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like this group. It's one of those cases, Jerry, at the end of it, and you were in the FBI, you do a lot of cases, and especially in the violent crime and drug realm, and you wonder if it made an impact. This one actually did, and backed up by numbers. The murder rate was down 47%, and the overall crime rate was down to 36%, down to 1974 levels. And for this area, that is a direct impact from that case.
Yeah, the numbers don't lie.
No, they don't. I worked OCDF cases in San Francisco, and you make some big cases, but it's almost like putting your thumb on a dam. The water's still coming through.
I know OCDF very well, having worked in the Philadelphia division and Camden, but you're going to have to explain the acronym for everyone.
Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force. And it's basically the funding mechanism from Congress. This case really took on so many facets. It had so many agencies involved. My piece was basically the CEO of the case, coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office, local DA's office, federal and local and state partners. It was one of those cases where just about every technique you can think of was used effectively. There were some twists and turns in this case that I still scratch my head. Sometimes truth is way stranger than fiction.
All right. Where would you like to start?
The Harvey Hustlers actually started back in the 1980s. Back then, it was a group of individuals from Harvey. And if you're familiar with the New Orleans area or Louisiana in general, in Louisiana, you don't have counties. They call them parishes. So when I use the word parish for the rest of the people not in Louisiana, that would be the same thing as a county for government. The Harvey Hustlers were based in Jefferson Parish, which is part of the New Orleans metropolitan area. If you look at a map of New Orleans, the Mississippi River runs basically right down the middle of New Orleans. And on one side, it's called the West Bank, and the other side, the East Bank. And the West Bank refers to the West Bank of the Mississippi River. The Harvey Hustlers were in Harvey, which is a unincorporated area of Jefferson Parish. It's all the same metropolitan area, but it's just not in New Orleans proper. It's in Jefferson Parish. For years, the Harvey Hustlers had a stranglehold on the narcotics trade on the West Bank in Jefferson Parish. They had a monopoly. They had no rival. I'm going to fast forward and give you all the history. When Hurricane Katrina struck, the West Bank of Jefferson Parish had some damage, but it was not flooded like the rest of New Orleans. There had been some street flooding, but it quickly receded, and the people that were on the West Bank could basically go about their lives. Obviously, with power came back on. The area of Harvey was one of the only places where if you were going to get drugs, you could go to Harvey and get drugs. We had informants tell us that the Harvey Hustlers, the neighborhood that they controlled, right after Katrina, there was basically a traffic jam going into the neighborhood, and they were making $10,000 a day before noon every single day. So they, at one time, were really in the lucrative drug trade. But like all things, they were not happy with being successful entrepreneurs, as what they would call themselves. For them, being on the street and having the reputation of being the biggest, baddest people in the area was way more than important to them, taking their profit and calling it a day. They just couldn't get themselves to do that. So at that point had not gotten much federal attention. And Jerry, this is the only time in my law enforcement career this has ever happened. The U.S. Attorney's Office was working a case on a mass murderer, not like a serial killer, but a violent guy who was robbing people left and right, home invasions, and murdering them. During the course of that case, they developed information on a group of individuals called the Murder Squad. And I actually got a call from the AUSA, who was Dwayne Evans, who is now the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Louisiana. He called me because over the years I had developed a solid working relationship with Dwayne, and he told me, I want you to look at this gang. That's a first. Usually, as you're fully well aware, you're down at the U.S. Attorney's Office begging them to take a case. Well, I knew this was different. When you have the AUSA calling you, you know you immediately have buy-in. From there, we started looking at this group. We developed some informants. At one point during this case, one of the subjects was a suspect in a murder, and the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office had executed a search warrant on his apartment. And when they got in there, they found the stolen rifle of a murdered New Orleans police officer, Thelonious Dukes. And that was one of the victims in the original case that the U.S. Attorney's Office was investigating. When that came to light, we did the basic background. We saturated the area. We got incredible amount of cooperation from the sheriff's office. And at that point, Jerry, it was straight old-fashioned police work. No sophisticated techniques. From there, we did develop some informants, and we started to build a picture. We started going back and looking at old homicides and all unsolved gun cases, and a more clear picture came together. And from that, we were able to basically lay out the organization. And what it was, you had a parent organization called the Harvey Hustlers. Within the Harvey Hustlers, there was a enforcement arm called the Murder Squad. A lot of times you'll see people that claim we're the Murder Squad. These guys actually were. I can't describe them anything but stone cold killers. And they didn't hide it. They had MS tattooed on their neck, Murder Squad. Murder Squad was, I guess, a subsidiary of the Harvey Hustlers, for lack of a better term. And the Harvey Hustlers was ran by a guy named David Williams. He went by the name Mr. Harvey. And he actually had a recording contract and was kind of an up-and-coming rapper, but he also was controlling the narcotic supply to the organization. Mr. Harvey was responsible for ordering several murders. Two of his most trusted partners were two brothers, Jermaine Hudson and Melvin Hudson. Melvin Hudson went by the name Killer Kane. That was an accurate description of what he was about. And his brother Jermaine. They started the Murder Squad. Well, everything was going smooth, except there started to become a rift within the gang. Jermaine and Melvin, they wanted to be the top dog. These were three alpha males. There's a little bit of rift that started to develop within the group. And it culminated with two individuals that were close to the Hudson brothers had somehow crossed Mr. Harvey, and Mr. Harvey had him executed. When they were executed, that started a whole civil war, basically, within the Harvey Hustlers. And it came to two camps, those loyal to the Hudson brothers and those loyal to David Williams, Mr. Harvey. Well, at some point during, this is all back in 2009, 2010, David Williams had one of the Hudson's closest friends murdered. His name was Laval London. And in retaliation for that, the Hudson brothers, although they were never charged with this, executed David Williams. That set off a chain of events that basically it was shoot on sight between now rival gang members. They were once one big happy gang family, and now the most violent group in possibly in the whole New Orleans area were in an all-out civil war. And Jerry, when I tell you that there were times we couldn't keep up with the murders, and one night there was 5 or 6.
Wow.
Most of the time, you would think if the head of the Harvey Hustlers was murdered, that may be the end of it. Well, it wasn't, because David Williams had a brother, Robert Williams. Robert Williams is maybe the most stone-cold killer, maybe even more than the Hudsons, that I've ever come across. He was ruthless. What you had now, it was probably 7 by 7, maybe 49 square miles, not a big area.
A lot of times when you hear about these wars between gangs or mob factions, you also hear about innocent bystanders being killed or shot or injured during their gun battles. Was that happening also?
Unfortunately, Jerry, yes, multiple times. They all stick out in my mind, but the ones that really stick out in my mind A group loyal to Robert Williams had just that night, earlier in the evening, had a running gun battle with another rival group that had nothing. They weren't Harvey Hustlers. This was just another group that they had a beef with. They decided after this shootout, they were going to go to a neighborhood and shoot up the house of an associate of the Hudson brothers of the murder squad. And it's about 2 a.m. in the morning. They walk down the street and they see the house, and there is a 58-year-old guy named Emil Washington. Emil was one of those guys. He always had a drink in his hand, whether it be a bottle with a brown bag, and walked the neighborhood, bumming cigarettes, harmless. Everyone knew him, but he certainly wasn't part of this gang war. He just happened to be in front of this house that they were going to shoot up. And when they started shooting, he started running. And Jerry, 4 individuals from the Harvey Hustlers chased him down in cold blood, 2 with AK-47s, 2 with handguns, and stood over him and shot and killed him. For no reason. They didn't know him. They had no idea who he was. He just happened to be someone walking down the street. They killed him. And that happened to be, for the benefit of law enforcement, had to be all captured on a home surveillance video camera. Same group, within days, went to rob and shoot another rival drug dealer. They did their own entry into a house, but the person they were looking for was in a back room, and they encountered an 81-year-old grandmother, Doretha Richardson, and they stood over her and shot and killed her. Another one, they're driving down the road. They think they see a rival drug dealer in a car. They spin around, and it's a husband and wife, Shauna Gerard and Willie Odom. I don't know if they'd had a beef with them, but there were 2 small children in the back seat, and they pulled up next to them and shot them with an AK-47, killed them. Fortunately, the 2 children, babies, were not injured, but it wasn't several hours until law enforcement found them in the back seat because it got called in as a car accident. Another time, Jerry, on this same case, it's 4 a.m. in the morning, and we had information. We had a warrant out for one of the members for the Harvey Hustlers. It was a long story, but he was a 20-year-old senior in high school who was actually on a spring break trip. And we had information he was coming back on a bus from Florida and coming to the school, which was in the heart of the Harvey Hustler territory. He was a Harvey Hustler. So we had a couple Jefferson Parish marked units, and myself and a couple detectives were waiting in the parking lot. We were going to arrest this guy when he came off the bus. While we're waiting there, the bus pulls up, and I heard a loud noise, and my initial thought was, it's 4 a.m., why is someone out in the street firing up a jackhammer? That's what it sounded like. It sounded like the big jackhammer when you're breaking up concrete. Seconds later, we heard tires squealing and people screaming, and from there, just because we had 2 marked units with us, the pursuit happened, and it went all the way into New Orleans, 100 miles an hour plus. And that car had spun out, and they had all jumped over the side of I-10, and probably a 30, 40-foot drop. And they found 4 of these guys huddled up in tall grass. One had a compound fracture of his leg. But what they had done, just coincidentally, they were Harvey Hustler members also. They were going to try to kill a rival, and they knocked on an apartment door and identified themselves as police. 2 elderly women came to the door, and there was 2 infants in the room. And they just started shooting the place up. I believe one of the infants lost an arm. No one died in that one, but they were all severely injured. So unfortunately, this group, it did not matter to them who got in their way.
So I thought you were going to say that when this Harvey Hustler was getting off the bus, he was going to be ambushed by a rival. But you just happened to be in the area where an ambush of another gang member was happening in a nearby apartment complex.
That's correct. Pure coincidence. It was an adjacent parking lot. The school parking lot ended. There was a chain link fence, and there was an apartment complex that shared the same parking lot. I can't say we had intel this was going to happen, and we certainly wouldn't have let that happen, but that was a very sobering event because I was there personally when it happened. And that would later come up in the trial of Robert Williams, because during this case, we had 6 Title IIIs, 2 Group 2 undercover operations. We used grand juries. We used poll cams. We tracked phones, GPS tracking. If you could do it, we did it. Robert Williams was such a cold-blooded killer that we intercepted him on a phone call after this event had happened because people had been talking about it. And I think his exact words, he goes, I don't care about those women and children and all that. I just don't want anyone talking about this. So that was actually played at his trial. He ended up getting 120 years on his trial. But this case, Jerry, I've never seen a group. Either they were responsible for or victims of. It's hard to determine when you have a civil war, but we're talking in excess of 50 homicides by this group.
That is actually mind-boggling. Let me ask you just real quick, when you're going after such a large group and you have so many open murder cases and all this violent crime, it takes, as they say, a village. In addition to the FBI, who else are you working with?
Okay, this is a point I really wanted to stress because this is how this case, I believe, was such a success. I had a great partner and ally, Karen Avanosky. She's an ATF agent. She had a parallel case with 4 or 5 of these guys in a drug-related homicide. The guy owed him $100 and they killed him over it. Unbeknownst to us, they were looking at that angle. And when we got together with the sheriff's office, we realized that they had a case. So we started working with Karen, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I got to say the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. Without them, we couldn't have done it. They may be the largest law enforcement agency in the state of Louisiana. If not, they're one of the biggest. The support we got from them, I had access to all of their informants. They have 5 narcotics groups, and it was an OCDF case, so they were all working diligently on this thing. And without them, Jerry, this doesn't happen because the intel we got from them, the informant base we got from them, they manned our wiretaps. Half our shifts were manned by Jefferson Parish Sheriff's detectives, which was a fantastic thing we had going. And then just when this case was, hopefully it didn't, I thought it was about to fizzle. What happened is Dwayne Evans was the original AUSA on this case. And during this time, Dwayne got promoted, but Dwayne realized this was a career case. He didn't want to let it go, but he didn't have the time to really work on it. So he brought in another AUSA, and I've told them this story several times. You've heard of the marketing scheme called the bait and switch.
Yes, I'm an old fraud economic crime agent, so I definitely heard of that.
My task force officer from Jefferson Parish, Brad Roniger, and we had information boxes and case files and diagrams and ballistic evidence to show all these homicides were related and committed by the same people. But no one had been willing to look at it as the overall picture. They'd all looked at one-off cases. And at that time, none of the cases by themselves were that strong. But when you put them all together, it painted a picture. A guy named Colin Sims was the AUSA. And Brad and I had a little plan. We went to Colin, went to Dwayne Evans and said, hey, listen, all we need you to do is help us get up on this wiretap. All I want you to do is review the affidavit. And we got it from there. He agreed. He's like, okay, great. Well, we knew we had way more than that. So we just didn't tell him yet. So we got the wiretap. Once he got that up, we said we wanted to have a meeting with one day. And Jerry, we unloaded probably 10,000 pages worth of documents on him. When we explained it to him, he goes, you guys knew this all along, didn't you? I said, we certainly did. I said, Colin, we had to get you in somehow. Dwayne Evans handled the original 12 indictments. And then from there, Colin Sims indicted 18 more. Halfway through that, Colin Sims became the chief criminal prosecutor for the local district attorney's office. And now Colin's the DA. During that time, we were rolling, and then Colin had the opportunity to become the chief criminal prosecutor at the district attorney's office, and we were kind of back to square one. That's when I met a ADA, Doug Fries from Jefferson Parish, who subsequently now works for Colin Sims at the St. Tammany district attorney's office. And Doug Fries took my case files. My wife, who's an FBI agent, met him on a Friday, gave him the case files of all the people I thought needed to be indicted on a racketeering case. That was on a Friday, and on Tuesday, Doug Fries called me, and he said, I see you've got this list of, I think it was 22 people. I said, yes. He goes, well, I have a problem. And I thought, oh, here we go. Prosecutor's pushing back. And he said, why didn't you include all these others? And I about fell out of my chair. I said, Doug, let's go. A couple of months later, he indicted 26 more.
Wow. Isn't that great?
And I'll tell you what, the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the District Attorney's Office, ATF, I had some help with DEA. It helped me with some surveillances. It could not have been more of a team. And then on my squad, I was in the Safe Streets Gang Squad. I basically just incorporated as many people as I could into the team, and it worked out great. This case, it sounds like I'm jumping all over the place because it literally, if you looked at the organizational chart or the timeline of events, it looks like someone just took a paint can and splashed it on the wall. It really is all over the place. At the end of the day, we had some great luck. Also, Jerry, I'll tell you, during our times of our wiretaps, we had a wiretap up on Robert Williams, who was David Williams's brother, who was just a stone cold killer. Well, they actually all were stone cold killers. So it's what degree of stone cold killer are we talking about here? We had a wiretap up on Robert Williams. They were obviously trying to re-up their supply of crack and heroin, and were having a hard time. And they reached out eventually. It was a phone number out of Dallas. And we had no idea who it was. And the guy from Dallas kept sending one of his local people in New Orleans. We didn't know who he was. They'd met a few times. So I think the fourth time they met, they were meeting at a call them daiquiri shops here, but they're basically pool halls, nightclubs. We had our surveillance team out there with air coverage. We had Jefferson Parish out there. So we had this place covered. The only thing we wanted to do, we weren't going to interrupt the deal. We were going to let it go. I just wanted to somehow ID who was bringing this new source of supply for cocaine they had. Well, what's the saying? No plan survives first contact, which we didn't plan on, that the parking lot would have 200 or 300 people in it. When they showed up and they got lost in the crowd, we couldn't tell who was who. We were several re-ups into this wiretap. So I just made the decision, look, we got to get something out of this. We were kind of winding down the wiretap. So I said, when our main subject leaves, we knew he was just getting resupplied. Follow him for a couple miles and pull him over. That all seemed to be going very well, except when they went to pull him over, I learned later after the fact, he put a gun to the driver's head and told him to take off. So take off they did. That chase, Jerry, probably went 10 miles through city streets. We had the plane up, so they were never going to get away, but they ditched the car in a residential area with a bunch of apartments, and 2 jumped out, and the plane was able to spot them with the night vision immediately, and they were apprehended. But 3 of them, 2 of our subjects, Robert Williams, his half-brother, and his girlfriend, went into an apartment complex. And they knew what building he was in. We just didn't know what unit he was in. I'm back in the wire room and I'm listening to the phone calls, and they're basically calling their friends. It's kind of comical because they're whispering because they think the police are right out in the hall, which we weren't. We were out in the parking lot surrounding the place, and they are basically giving a play-by-play of what just happened. That's basically a confession. You couldn't get better evidence of that. They said they threw the guns and the drugs out by a school. We were able to retrace the steps and we found the guns and drugs. So at that time, I had our SOG team leader was chomping at the bit to go in and get them. They had the sheriff's office. Little did they know what we were hearing. I said, back off. We're letting them go. Because they just kept talking and talking and talking. He couldn't get better evidence than that. So I think they were probably a little upset with me that night. That was one of the events that obviously we got the drugs, the guns, but we're not able to identify the guy that had brought the drugs. And that was the whole intent of our taking that off, was to identify him. Fast forward, we did a spinoff Title III on the supplier from Dallas. He was constantly calling this guy. And a trusted friend of mine, great task force partner, he was a task force agent in our squad named Jeremiah Washington. He's from the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. He just happened to be sitting in the wire room one night, and he's reviewing old calls, and he hears this voice of the guy we could not identify who had a little bit of a stutter. And Jeremiah says, I know that voice. I arrested that guy. So you're kidding me. He goes, no, I know that guy. So he went and found his old report. And sure enough, Jerry, that's who it was. He just did it off of voice recognition because he happened to be in the wire room one night.
So all of that with the wire and the surveillances and the chases and something so simple helped identify him, just recognizing his voice.
100%. And then because we had such a close, I'll tell you what, I spent 95% of my time at Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office in the Detective Bureau. I'm sure there's people at Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, if they didn't see where my check came from, didn't know that I was in Jefferson Parish, because that's where I was. We were so connected at the hip. When we identified him, the next day I get a call from homicide. They had him as this guy, his name was Elka Smith, is a prime suspect in a drug-related homicide. And we were able to take phone calls and piece together historical evidence and cell site information and convict him of murder eventually. It worked out great.
But that's just the beginning, because now that you've identified him, you still want to know who he works for in Dallas.
Yep, and we did. We ended up being a guy from New Orleans who had went to Dallas and moved to Dallas. And here's where sometimes you wish you could have went further. So what happened with that, we identified a significant group in Houston that was actually supplying this guy in Dallas that the DEA had spent years trying to get into. And these guys were cartel guys out of Houston. So we passed the information to them for their end of it. And our goal then was to try to get up on the phone of Elka Smith, who eventually got charged with murder. Here's what happened, Jerry. The guy kept changing his phones literally every 4 or 5 days. I had a roving Title III wiretap application back at DOJ, and all of a sudden his phone calls stopped. And we couldn't figure it out. Sometimes an arrest is a good thing, but sometimes it's a bad thing. He was coming back from Houston with 10 kilos of coke, and the Texas Sheriff's Office at the border did a traffic stop and arrested him. So he wasn't getting out on that. So that shut us down on our wiretap potential for the New Orleans area. From there, we indicted the guy in Dallas, and the Houston Connect probably got cold feet, and it went dry. As a result of that, Doug Freeze, who I'd mentioned before, the ADA in Jefferson Parish at the time, did something I don't know if anyone in the state of Louisiana has ever done. He indicted a guy out of Houston in racketeering charge who'd never stepped foot in the state of Louisiana, but he did indict him in Louisiana. So we did get something out of that. And then the quantity of drugs that they were bringing in through that source, Nathan Carter was his name, in Dallas, was probably 20 to 40 kilos a month, which for this area is pretty substantial. The wiretaps were great, but I'll tell you some of the things that, you watch TV and you ever been in an interview and you think, oh, hopefully we'll get something, and you hit the home run. We had this same group, actually the same four that I had said earlier had shot and killed Emil Washington and shot and killed the 81-year-old grandmother. They had done their own basic felony car stop on a guy who had paid them with a fake $100 bill for heroin.
Oh,
Yeah.
these don't sound like the type of folks that you want to play those type of games with.
No. And they shot him up pretty good, but he lived. He took one round to the backside. Jefferson Parish had put together this elaborate ballistics chart of all these guns that had been used in the same crimes. Well, they had linked it to the shooting at this guy. Well, this guy was still alive. We looked at that and said, we got to go talk to this guy. Well, we went and talked to him, and he named who it was. He wasn't afraid at all. He said, yeah, that's who it was. So in the meantime, we'd flipped one of these guys. His name was Isaac Smith, and a stone cold killer. Isaac Smith had told us about all these murders. He didn't know we had all the ballistics, and what he told us matched all the ballistics we had. So we had this guy who had paid with the fake $100 bill tell us the same thing. That went into the indictment for all these other murders that hadn't been solved. That's what helped us with that. It had nothing to do with wiretaps. That was just old school Columbo type of police work, which was really refreshing.
And you're right. This case has just so many twists and turns and information that you've gotten from this source and that place and this technique. You were saying that you were kind of like the CEO of this entire investigation. And I'm wondering how you were able to keep it all together and kind of wrap your arms around it.
When you start it from the beginning and you live it every day, it makes it a lot easier than to have someone tell it to you. I would empathize with any prosecutor that if you sat down and tried to explain to this, hey, look, this is what we've been doing for the last X amount of years, they'd be scratching their head like, what are you talking about? Fortunately, we had prosecutors on board from the very beginning. That was key. I didn't have to explain the case because Dwayne Evans and Colin Sims and Doug Freeze, they knew the case as well as I did, the prosecutors. So that was a plus. I'm going to give a lot of prompts to my training agent, Chris Campion, who you had on here a few episodes ago. I learned my first 5.5 years at the Bureau with him, the importance of liaison with local law enforcement. I probably gave him nightmares and headaches, but the one thing I did take away was that, and there's nothing that could help more than that. You're right. There's so many twists and turns and so many sub-stories. It's really not a linear type case where it's a bank robber, you get some evidence, you get a demand note, you get some fingerprints, you make an arrest. It was way more involved than that. It's the collaboration, and we lived it daily. I can talk about it off the top of my head. I can empathize with someone that wasn't there scratching your head like, this is a beast.
I don't know where you're going to go next, but I'd love to kind of do a profile of more of the gang members if you're ready to do that.
Absolutely. Some of the ones that we consider the leaders. Let's start with Melvin Hudson. Melvin Hudson, a.k.a. Killer Kane, an imposing figure, probably 6'4", 290, but with his dreadlocks was probably closer to 6'8". He's one of those people that just struck fear into people. I remember one of our state partners had interviewed him in a case prior. I don't even remember what they interviewed him about. When I talked to the state detective about this guy, he said, that guy struck fear in my heart. And to hear a seasoned police officer say that, that really is something. Melvin Hudson at one time was making so much money selling drugs, he did not care. He didn't care about the money. He kept saying, even on the wiretap we had a wiretap on him, Jerry, that only lasted 6 days because we had to take it down because we intercepted him getting hired for a hit. We didn't know who he was going to kill, but it was obvious that he was going to kill somebody. So we had already had enough to charge him with heroin distribution. We had to take him off the street 6 days into a wiretap. We had listened to him on jail calls. He was talking about Mr. Harvey, who at one time was his partner. And he was talking about the fact that Mr. Harvey wasn't as much of a stone cold killer as he was, because he said Mr. Harvey shot him from a distance. He said he liked to walk up on him. That's what kind of person we're talking about here.
So this is somebody bragging about being a murderer on the prison phone, which they know all calls are being recorded.
You know what? I know they know it. I don't know if they forget, but yes. And that was one of the things that Dwayne Evans, who at the time was the AUSA, heard on jail calls. And he called me. He goes, hey, you got to look at this guy. When the AUSA calls and says that, that's why I'm like, oh. And when I heard that, you're right. I about fell out of my chair. I'll give you an example. The original nexus of this way back, and I had mentioned that it started with a case on a guy named Stephen Hardrick who had killed so many people. They were listening to his jail calls, and he kept talking about Killer Kane. And he kept saying, that guy's the real deal. Well, if the guy you're listening to is responsible for all these homicides, and he says this guy's the real deal, that should make your ears stand up. And he was. He lived up to his name. His brother, Jermaine Hudson, his nickname was Fresh. Stone Cold Killer also. They basically walked up to Mr. Harvey when they killed him on his porch and just emptied their guns into him. Jermaine Hudson is good for probably as many homicides as his brother Melvin. He was a little bit more shrewd on the drug dealing. And they're all family. We had 3 Hudson brothers, Jermaine, Travis, and Melvin. Travis probably wasn't quite as violent as his 2 younger brothers. The other section, David Williams and Robert Williams, they were all one time a big happy family, but Robert Williams and David Williams were brothers. And David Williams, who was the original head of the Harvey Hustlers, he's a suspect in multiple homicides. And if he didn't pull the trigger himself, he had it done. He's also very flashy. He would hang out with these Atlanta-based rappers, some that have national recording contracts. He cut a few videos. He had some local airplay on one of his songs, and it was called Swag Crazy, which just happened to be the name of their OCDF case was Operation Swag Crazy, and it was based on his song. And his brother, Robert Williams, walked with a limp because someone had shot him in the knee with a shotgun at one point in his life. Just vile. We had intercepted calls, underage girls he was having relations with. One was still in gym class. She was at school. I don't know if we couldn't even identify her, but she was obviously in high school, and he was in his mid to late 30s. These younger ones followed him. They literally followed him like a cult figure. I don't know if it was out of fear or respect, but whatever he said went. He had somehow been in and out of jail, but nothing had ever stuck with him. And then some of the younger ones, we had Isaac Smith. I'd mentioned him before. He was one of the trigger men that killed Emil Washington, the elderly 58-year-old guy walking down the street, minding his own business. They shot and killed the 81-year-old grandma. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I can tell you one of the things he did is what he posted the night he shot the 81-year-old. All 4 of them had been shooting, and he caught a round in the backside of his arm. This is how, I don't know if these guys didn't care, they were that dumb, or just not thinking at the time. He went to a hospital, and while he's in the hospital getting treated for his gunshot wound that he took as friendly fire, his Instagram picture with his photo in the hospital said, "Took friendly fire while I stood over a bitch tonight."
Oh my goodness. Now, you're talking about callous.
Yes.
And stupid. That's evidence.
Yeah, that was evidence.
Not only is it evidence, but it's my understanding that the hospital is obligated, has to contact law enforcement when somebody comes in with a gunshot wound.
Well, so here's what happened. As dumb as they were and as smart as they thought they were, they went to a hospital not in the area. So it got reported, but there was no issue of any other homicide or shooting that night in that area. They didn't go to a local hospital. They went a couple parishes over. They were thinking that, but then he puts that on Instagram. This is the same guy that callously stood over a 58-year-old guy in the middle of the street and shot and killed him for no reason whatsoever. And originally, he was one of our cooperators that had came in and proffered early on and then admitted all these homicides. But then he said another guy in the gang did it. We found out later it was also Isaac Smith. So the judge ripped up his plea agreement and gave him life.
Yeah, that's the one thing about plea agreements and proffers. Got to tell the truth.
Yeah, there's so many, I don't know if characters is the right word. We had several brothers. We had several families. We had the Gums family that Charlie and Charles, they were twins. One was Charlie, one was Charles. Keitrell, who was another Gums. They're all family and they're all cousins. The ones related to David Williams and his crew, the Harvey Hustlers, were all somewhat related. And then you had the Hudsons on the murder squad side. They were all related. So not only was it affiliated by group, they were blood relatives. You really had a volatile mix there. Jerry, this one just is one of those individuals you never forget that had every opportunity in the world. And now you wonder if he regrets the path he chose. There was a guy named Kentez Gaydon. Nickname was Kenny Boo. And Jerry, when he was in high school, he was top 10 in the nation in the 100-meter dash. Top 10. Apparently, he was also an honor student. That's someone that had the world at their fingertips if they wanted it.
So much promise, so much potential.
Also a cousin to David Williams.
That's where the genetics didn't play out well for him.
Yep. You would think this guy had everything going for him. So during this gang war, he fell victim to a drive-by running gun battle down an expressway in Jefferson Parish where he lost both legs and an arm.
The guy that was top 10 in the nation for track?
Yes.
Wow, that is just...
And when I heard that happen, it sounds callous. My initial response is, this guy is going to be the first guy we're going to talk to. He's going to testify in a heartbeat. Nope. Jerry, as a matter of fact, he was never charged with this, but then I believe it to be the case. He was suspect in several murders after that where they just held him up in the back seat in his wheelchair and pointed the gun and he did the shooting. That's the kind of people we're talking about.
Okay, that description gives us an idea of how vicious and violent these gang members were.
Yeah, I can't fathom that. Been a decade now almost. I wonder where he sees his life, where it could have been, where it ended up. I cannot understand it. That one really struck me. I'll never forget that. If you look at him, there's a video on YouTube. It's a Harvey Hustler video. It's called Kill Every Snitch. It's a take on, I can't remember the rapper, but if you look at the video, there's probably 40 of them in this video. Of them, 35 are either dead or in prison. When this group flamed out, they went out in spectacular fashion.
Wow. Anybody else you want to profile?
Yeah, Ken Tesgaden, David Williams, Mr. Harvey, you can Google him and go on YouTube. He was very flamboyant. Actually, by all accounts, a talented rapper, but they were born into the life, and that street life really meant everything to them. It's something I can't relate to, but I'll tell you what, I'm not going to name them just for safety of them and their families, but we had some very, very brave people that cooperated with us and informants. Without them, when you work with them for years and develop that bond, I know there's that separation between informant and agent. The bravery of some of these people that they just had enough of the violence. They did several controlled purchases for us and they were put at risk. Fortunately, we never had one exposed or hurt, but I just have a perspective. I spent so much time in those neighborhoods for the people that had to live in fear. I'm not ignorant enough to think we solve violent crime. That's not the case. But those informants that came forward, you develop a bond and an empathy for their life. Some of them never had a chance, but in the end, they did the right thing. There's another one. I'll give you an example. A guy named Harry Smoot. Harry Smoot went to play football at Grambling University. Didn't graduate, but he was kind of the businessman behind their heroin supply. He's doing life for murder. He was part of the Doretha Richardson murder. He was the driver. Here's another guy who had a college. I don't know if he got a full ride to play football at Grambling. Didn't graduate. By all accounts, a smart guy. He'd evaded law enforcement for the longest time until we had got a hold of him and intercepted him on wiretaps. Some of these guys, like Melvin Hudson, he was probably born a killer. And these other guys, I can't explain it. It's that need to belong to something. Ken Tesgaden, who was the track star, and Harry Smoot, the football star, I don't get it. It's hard for me to get my arms wrapped around.
And I take it for some, just growing up in a particular neighborhood means that they really never had a chance.
Yeah, and I really believe they didn't. I mean, David Williams, Mr. Harvey, his dad was the founder of the Harvey Hustlers, so he didn't really have a chance. The Hudson brothers, you go back to them until they both got significant federal time. You can look at their arrest records going back, not convicted, but suspects in several homicides, fighting with the police, shooting at the police. It just goes on and on and on. For a while, that neighborhood they lived in, it's called Scottsdale. It's an area in Jefferson Parish. It was figuratively the killing fields. It seemed like almost every night there was a homicide, and it all attributed to them. Some of these other youngsters, Ray Woodruff was one of the killers of Emil Washington. Frankie Hookfin was one of the guys that shot up the apartment when we just happened to be there. He was a suspect in the murder of a 17 and a 15-year-old. These guys were no joke. They were ruthless and vicious. And fortunately, all the violent ones, Jerry, are doing, I believe, no less than 30 years, most doing life. And Robert Williams was sentenced in state court to 120. One of the things about this group, if you're familiar with anything with New Orleans area gangs, there's real no affiliation. There's no national gangs, really no structure. It's basic neighborhood gangs or groups that hung out together.
That's very similar to Philadelphia.
Okay. Basically, whoever had the drug supply was the leader. Well, the Harvey Hustlers were about as organized as you're going to get in this area. They're not Bloods, they're not Crips, but there was a structure. They had tattoos, and it was an ever-evolving gang. But hopefully, that gang is extinct. You never know. It's like I said before, we didn't stamp out violent crime in the area, but for that time period, we certainly took a bite out of it.
All right. So was there a large takedown, or did you just individually just keep like a whack-a-mole, just keep arresting different people?
Both. We had 3, what I would call major takedowns, with the presses rolling and press conferences, simultaneous search warrants, entry, arrest warrants, about half and half. I think all told, it was probably over 100 taken into custody over the course of this case. But some of them, we would scoop them up individually. Like Melvin Hudson, we had a wiretap up on him, but we had to take it down 6 days in because he was going to kill someone. So he was a one-off. We were up on another wire at the same time on one of his partners, and we had to take that down in day 12, I believe, because we intercepted a call where he was going to retaliate for a shooting he'd just been shot at. So we had to take that down. Those guys were not part of a big roundup. I believe the first one we rounded up 14, and then the biggest roundup we had was 20 at one time. And out of those, maybe 3 were fugitives for a while. We ended up getting every single one of them. During that whole course of that case, there's so many different sidebars of things that just come to mind. I remember doing a controlled purchase once at a gas station with one of these Harvey Hustlers. It's one of those like, okay, I hope the camera we have works, and I hope we can ID him for the later on. Well, unbeknownst to him, when he told our informant to come meet him, we were in a truck, and apparently he didn't see us in the truck. He told the informant to come meet him, and he sat on the hood of our bumper and did the deal right there. So that was there was no.
Wait a minute, wait a minute. You were sitting in the truck while he was doing the deal, sitting on the hood.
Yeah, we were parked at a Shell gas station, and he was leaning on our bumper with his back to us and never turned around. He called the informants to come over by this truck. Things like that just happened to work out where he did that. You do a case like this, and there's some things that you just never forget. We had one where we had an informant wired up and all the tech equipment fell out. And we thought, oh, this isn't good. And they picked it up, didn't know what it was, and handed it back to the informant. It's just stuff like that you'll never forget. We did have a 3-week trial in this case. Robert Williams and Elka Smith. Elka Smith is the one we identified because he had the stutter on his speech, and the district attorney's office decided to put Robert Williams and Elka Smith on trial together, and both got convicted, but that was a significant trial. This case had everything. It had mostly all pleas. I think 15 of our subjects were killed along the way, so we lost them. We'd have setbacks. I remember their first wiretap. We tried to get a wiretap on Mr. Harvey, and I actually had the affidavit down range at OEO, and he got killed. Leading up to that, Laval London, who had been killed, actually Mr. Harvey had him killed, was one of our named interceptees. He got killed. So it almost seemed like every time we put someone as an interceptee, they ended up dead. And it wasn't anything that we were doing. It's just because these guys, it was so violent that time that it was like a war zone.
Not that I'm trying to be sympathetic to killers. I just can't imagine living a life in that type of environment where at any minute, you could be killed.
Oh, I don't want to seem sympathetic, but I do. I empathize. They had no chance. I'll give you an example. Robert Williams had no chance. His brother David, that was the life they were born into. Now, they embraced it. They fully embraced it. But Robert Williams is a charismatic guy. He had leadership qualities. He got these guys to follow him. He could have told them to do anything. They were going to do it, whether it was just out of straight fear or he had something about him that got people to follow him. I'll give you an example. He got arrested during the case. He bonded out, but he gets taken into custody by Jefferson Parish. I get a call. I think it was a Thursday night, Friday night, but it was about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. I get a call from one of their detectives. Said, hey, we just arrested Robert Williams. He says he only talked to you. I'd never met Robert Williams, but a lot of his people had been indicted previously. I was the case agent, so he knew my name. I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be, he's had enough. He wants to just talk, but he wants to talk to me. Jerry, I drove down. It was probably 45 minutes to get there. I went in the interview room with him. It was just us. And I looked at him. He looked at me and he said, I just wanted to put a name to a face. That's what he said.
And didn't say anything else.
Nope. He said, hey, I've heard your name. I said, what'd you heard of, Robert? And I'll give him credit. He told me that the word was from his people that never lied to him. When I told him they'd been indicted, I gave him a shot. I said, this is what's going to happen. And he said, you didn't go back on your word. I said, I thought you were coming here to help yourself out, Robert. He goes, nope, I just wanted to meet you. And I don't know if that was an intimidation thing or that he saw himself as the leader of that group. He must have saw me the leader of the investigation. I still to this day don't know why. He was not disrespectful, very calm. And even when he got sentenced to 120 years, he didn't break down. In a case that spans that scope and that long, there's so many different side stories. Some of them comical. The tech failures that you had, things that happened in juries. We had that trial. Jerry, this is what kind of people we were dealing with. Robert Williams had paid someone $10,000 to kill one of his rivals. Our witness was the one who pulled the trigger and shot a guy in the head. That was our witness. This is the kind of people we were going to trial with.
But those were the people who had the information, who had the intelligence.
Absolutely. You got to make a deal with the devil. I'll remember a guy, his name was Raheem Robinson. He had killed a guy. We had it on video. It was in a surveillance camera from a bar room. Just before he was supposed to testify, the bailiffs come in and there's some commotion. Well, he decided he didn't want to testify, so he flooded the toilet in his cell, and he somehow kept flushing it and flooded the whole cell block. Eventually, we cleaned him up, and he came in to testify. Those are some of the things that you just never, ever forget. During the trial, he had outbursts on the stand. Some of my white-collar agent friends, I don't think they would grasp the concept of using someone who's admitted to multiple homicides as your star witness. And when you're in that realm, those are the things you have to do. We did a search warrant one of the girlfriends, I had gotten stuck with something and she started laughing at me. I just like, this 18-year-old girl is sitting there hardened already laughing because I cut my finger open on a search warrant. I think you said it best. The amount of talent, if they would have been raised in a different environment, who knows? Kentez Gaden might have been an Olympian, might have been a scholar student. Who knows? Robert Williams, he definitely had leadership characteristics. Now, it was one of the most vicious gangs and I think we've ever seen. But he still had those characteristics in a different setting. Who knows what they could have been? And it's really sad.
So you're talking about the callous laughter of an 18-year-old because you have a paper cut. I want to know about the danger, or if there were any situations where this group actually assaulted, attacked, or had hits on law enforcement.
I don't know of any organized attacks. I know there was Melvin Hudson, while we were trying to get up a wiretap on his phone, had a run-in with a Jefferson Parish deputy on the street. I'm not sure why Melvin Hudson assaulted the deputy, but it ended up in an all-out ground fight where Melvin Hudson was trying to get the deputy's pistol, and Melvin Hudson's gun fell into a drain. Ended up with the deputy being injured and Melvin Hudson getting arrested several hours later and spending some time in jail, got out. We were able to get up on his phone, but I'm not aware of any things like that. Now, I know during the wiretap of Robert Williams, we intercepted a call where he was sanctioning a hit on someone in a neighborhood. This scene could have been a story unto itself. I was at home. I get a call from the wire room, and the agent who had listened to this call, Keith Burris, who was a fantastic agent since retired, had deciphered this call where they were going in a neighborhood that we were familiar with to kill a guy. We only had a name, first name. He had a description of a car. So he called me. I, in turn, called my task force partner, Brad Roniger from the sheriff's office, who was at home. It was, I don't know, it was midnight on a random night. He called the deputies who were working that beat, and he got in his car and went as fast as he could, met with them in a parking lot, gave them the car description, said, find this car and pull him over for speeding or whatever it is. We want to give up our wire, but we needed to warn this guy. All within 45 minutes of that original call, this was planned together, and the deputies found the car, and he happened to be speeding. They pulled him over, and what do you think happens, Jerry? He gets out, and he runs. He had crack and a gun in the car. So he runs, they apprehend him, he gets arrested. We didn't tell him about the threat to his life because he was in jail later on when he went to court. We said, look, we saved your life. He went to trial and he lost. They were organizing hits 3 times during the wiretaps, and we had to intervene on what were organized hits. But there was no indication of targets on law enforcement.
Well, that particular arrest worked out well for you because there was no indication or thought that you had picked this up on a wiretap, because when they went looking for him, they find out that he's in jail. And so they have no thought of what really happened.
Right. So I don't know if it's funny or ironic. The guy takes off running. Little did he know, the only reason we were pulling him over is, well, he was speeding, but we were going to pull him over regardless to warn him. If he wanted to run and had the contraband on him, we were just going to warn him. And then he decided he appealed it. The search of his car and the pulling over his car, and it had always been held in federal court that under exigent circumstances, you could enter a residence, but it had never been decided by a court that applied to a vehicle. I don't know why. The original district court judge threw it out, said that there was no exigent circumstances, which is, I still can't fathom it. And thank God the U.S. Attorney's Office appealed it, and the Fifth Circuit overturned the district judge and upheld, and that's when he got convicted. But he knows it now. I don't know if he believes it or not, if he's never listened to the calls. If we wouldn't have intervened that night, I honestly believe he was a dead man, because the call that we intercepted, it was chilling. There was no ambiguity of what they were talking about. Now, someone that hadn't been listening to those types of calls in their career, or if you just played it for someone in the random supermarket, they might have not known what he was saying. We certainly did. There was no doubt when Robert Williams was telling these people to do was to take this guy out. And later on, we found out he was a cousin to one of the gang members who had aligned themselves with the murder squad. So that's what that was about.
How long in total did you work on this Harvey Hustler murder squad investigation? If you can just kind of go through the end results, the sentencings.
Yeah, sure. It started for my participation in 2008 is when we started that case. The last trial was in 2019, and we had indictments in 2010, 2012, and 2013 rounds. And in between there, we were picking people off left and right. A lot of the arrests we made, we tried to recruit them to work their case off, but a lot of them, I think out of fear, just pled straight up guilty to 35 years with no cooperation. The Hudson brothers got 27 years in federal prison. They're still serving it. That's Melvin and Jermaine. Travis Hudson, their older brother, got 20. Most of the significant players in the first federal indictment all got 20 years. And then the murderers, the ones that we convicted of murder, Harry Smoot got life in prison. Isaac Smith got life in prison. A handful of others pled to 47 and 45 years. Robert Williams was in state court. He got 120 years. Elka Smith was convicted for murder and racketeering in state court. He got 60 years for the racketeering and life for the murder, but the sentences range anywhere from 5 years to life. The average sentence was 20 years. We got some significant sentences out of this case.
What was the method of decision on whether something was going to be tried in state court or federal court?
That is a fantastic question. Here's how it happened. Earlier, I had mentioned that Dwayne Evans, who is now the U.S. attorney here, was the original AUSA, and he got promoted. And because he took on several responsibilities, he wasn't able to dedicate all his time to that. And that's when we did the bait and switch and got Colin Sims, who at that time was an AUSA. But halfway through that case, just after the original indictment, he took a job as the chief criminal prosecutor at the St. Tammany Parish DA's office. So in the interim, the first indictments we had done with Dwayne Evans, they all pled guilty. The ones that with Colin Sims, they all pled guilty. And then after Colin Sims left, this case was so cumbersome, there was a lull. Things were not progressing like I thought they should. And I knew I was sitting on all this evidence that we'd only scratched the tip of the iceberg. So at that point, Doug Freeze, who was an ADA in Jefferson Parish, I got together with him in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we decided to split them. One of the reasons Robert Williams, Jerry, was so influential that it was a conscious decision between the United States Attorney's Office and the DA's office and the FBI to split them, where Robert Williams, we did not want him in federal court. At that time, when we indicted all these guys, we held him out and put him in state court because we were afraid he'd influence all these people, because there's a couple of jails where they all would be in that have federal contracts. We didn't want Robert Williams polluting them and getting in their heads not to cooperate. So that's where the decision was made. We took Robert Williams and separated him in the state. He got indicted. And then later on, just because of the manpower, instead of waiting for the federal prosecutors to stack them up, get done with one, and they like to go one at a time, indict, prosecute, and convict all 12, and then move on to the next ones, it was decided to make the biggest bang for our buck to take the rest of them into Jefferson Parish. And that's what we did. Why Robert Williams was not indicted with the rest of his crew was to keep him out of the pool so he couldn't corrupt these guys in the jailhouse.
I can't remember what you said about how long in total that you worked on this case.
Okay, so it started in 2008. The last trial was in 2019. So that's 11 years.
Wow.
It's not 11 years of full time. The hardcore investigation part of this case was from 2008 to 2013, but the rest was trial prep. The actual investigation where we're doing our undercovers, our controlled purchases with informants, our wiretaps, our surveillance, grand jury, that was about a 5-year span from 2008 to 2013.
I know that everyone in the community appreciated the hard work that you and the rest of the team did on this case. And you were awarded in 2016 the FBI Director's Award for Outstanding Criminal Investigations. In 2015, the Safe Streets Top 30 Gang Investigations. The 2015 Metropolitan Crime Commission Case of the Year. It goes on and on and on. And the whole premise or mission of drug gang squads is to disrupt and dismantle. So what is happening with Harvey Hustlers? Has it resurfaced with all new members?
No. Is it still an area that suffers drug problems and gang violence? Yes. Harvey Hustler controlled? No. But that's not to say that 5 years from now, who's to say? But as of today, that's the Scottsdale neighborhood, which was ground zero for them, is a completely different neighborhood. It really is. I'm not saying it's the best neighborhood in the world, but it's certainly not what it was like before.
I think that is the perfect way to end the case review. We are at the point of the interview where I like to ask my standard question, which is when and why you joined the FBI.
Well, Jerry, I can say that I probably took the most indirect path to the FBI that you could probably take. Originally went to school. I'd always thought the FBI would be pretty cool. I don't know if you remember, there was a famous FBI case in the early 80s called the Pizza Connection. It was Sicilian mafia. I can't remember the crime family, but basically one of the main people in this whole case was a pizza place in my hometown of Little Milton, Wisconsin. The FBI had rented an apartment above this, unbeknownst to us, for I don't know how long. When that hit the news, I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard in my life. I didn't think much of it. I thought FBI, like, I'm some small kid from a farm town, Wisconsin. I got no chance. So I went off, graduated from high school, went off to school, played baseball, and got a finance degree at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh, and worked at a bank for a year. And Jerry, it was not me. I was in Chicago working at a bank. So I went back to school for engineering at the University of Wisconsin. At that time, I thought the FBI was pretty cool, but that was 92, 93-ish, and I think there was a hiring freeze. So I forgot, didn't even think about it. Got done with school, started working for some engineering firms in Milwaukee, and my roommate one day said, "Hey, the FBI is hiring." I said, "Hey, all right." This was back when you didn't fill out an application online. You had to get a physical one. So that day, went to the Milwaukee field office, filled out an application, and also sent an application to Milwaukee Police Department. About, I don't know, a week later or so, I get a call and they said, "Hey, there's a testing date." I did phase 1 testing. My roommate did phase 1 testing and he called me. He goes, "Hey, you must have passed." And I didn't. I said, "Why?" He goes, "I got an envelope and you got a big package." That was like the SF-86 to fill out, and went through the interview process. And Jerry, 10 months later, I'm in the academy at Quantico in 99. 99-10 was my class. That's how I ended up in the FBI. And ironically, the first person I met waiting for the Quantico doors to open, we were in the little lobby area, was the Hattiesburg police officer, Natalie Phelan, and she ended up becoming my wife 5.5 years later.
One of those academy love stories. I actually had one in my class too, 8210.
Oh, really?
Yep.
We're still married today. So right out of the academy, this is just coincidence. Sacramento was my office and she was San Francisco. But before I left the academy, they told me I was going to South Lake Tahoe. And that's where Chris Campion was my training agent.
Yeah, Chris was on the show episode 316 when he reviewed the J.C. Dugard child abduction case.
I still owe him so much for putting up with me and teaching me so much. I was in Tahoe for 5.5 years and we got married and they transferred me to San Francisco where, Jerry, that's where I found my niche in the FBI. My wife had worked at Hell's Angels her whole time in California. In South Lake Tahoe, we did a bunch of cool stuff, but I wanted that type of action. So when I got there, I was on the JTTF for a little bit. One day, the OSADF supervisor said, "Hey, would you ever be interested in coming to my squad?" And I said, "Absolutely." That was on a Friday. I think on Tuesday, I was on the OSADF squad in San Francisco and loved every second of it. Our OSADF squad was a combination of FBI and DEA, and it was some of the most spectacular work you could ever imagine. We were on Title III. We basically never stopped when Title III would just roll over, and they all led down to Mexico. So it was fascinating. From there, we transferred to New Orleans, and I got the gang squad. My wife became JTTF. She's still with the Bureau. She's the public corruption supervisor now.
All right, well, just let her know I'm coming for her as soon as she retires.
I'll tell you what, she's got 2 cases that would knock your socks off, a Hell's Angels case and a Nuestra Familia prison gang.
I'm writing her name on the list, and I'm just waiting until she retires.
Hopefully that's sooner rather than later, but she's eligible now. She's mandatory in 7 years.
Well, I know how that goes. When the time is right, you know when you know.
Correct.
One of the many interesting things was the fact that you're from Wisconsin and now you're living and working in New Orleans, and you are now the chief of police.
I am. The only thing less likely than me becoming an FBI agent, Jerry, is me becoming a chief of police. I have been blessed. Funny story. I was not eligible to retire yet. This was going back several years. And Colin Sims, what I had talked about, was one of the prosecutors, the federal prosecutors who went to work for the district attorney's office, who is now the district attorney. he would call me all the time and he'd say, hey, when you're ready to retire, I want you to come work for me as a DA investigator. I didn't give it much thought. I had gotten out of the gang program and I had went to be the division's polygrapher. I did that for 3 years. My plan was to wind out my career on SOG. And Colin Sims kept calling me, and I was ignoring his calls because I thought he was calling me about coming to work for the DA's office. Finally, I answered the phone. He said, look, there's an opening for the Mandeville police chief. And Mandeville is the town I live in. It's a very upscale, affluent area of New Orleans. It's about 23 miles north. If you know the geography, there's Lake Pontchartrain, which is the big lake. New Orleans on the southern shore, and Mandeville's on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. Way different than New Orleans. I hadn't even known there's an opening, and I think the applications were closing within like a day. So I put together a resume and I filled out an application, didn't think a thing of it, Jerry. And a month later, I'm the chief of police in Mandeville.
Oh, good for them.
It's been fantastic. It's one of those, you get all the trend in the media and the public, it seems that around the country, anti-law enforcement. But I can honestly say where I'm at is the exact opposite. I'm in a community that supports law enforcement. We're very popular with the public. I think part of the tax, it's called a millage, where the public votes every 10 years to what they can raise the taxes to provide for police, passed with 83%. That's overwhelming. I'm in a place as challenging as doing a gang case is. Working in law enforcement where I'm at is way more challenging because as sophisticated as some of those investigative techniques can be in dealing with the characters you're dealing with, there's a path. If I have a murder or a drug deal, I know how to work that. I know how to write an affidavit for a Title III. But when you're in my position, we don't have what I would call traditional violent crime, knock on wood here. Our issues are quality of life issues, noise violations, loud mufflers, things like that. That is hard. There's no easy answer for that. On one hand, when you have violent crime, there's a playbook for that. There's no playbook for a muffler that I just heard one drive down the street now with a loud truck. And that's what people expect from us here. And it's a challenge every day, but I love every minute. I got a very supportive mayor, very supportive city council, a very supportive public. We've got a good police department. We've got about 56 employees and 45 of those are officers. It's not LAPD, but for Louisiana police departments, it's on the larger size. We're not as big as nearly as NOPD or Baton Rouge and some of the sheriff's offices, but for your municipalities, it's on the bigger side. And I've got it good here. I really do. Our budget's good and our officers are good. And it's a good deal. And I live 5 minutes away, Jerry.
You're living the life.
Yeah. It can be stressful, when FBI, you're team building, you're doing that. And I'm still doing that here. But when you're FBI, I know you answer to the public, but not directly. Now I answer to the public directly. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah, I'm sure you need to be a little bit of a politician at the same time.
You absolutely do. I am a politician, and I don't mean that in the negative connotation that people hear when they hear politician, but I meet with city council people and business leaders and taking calls like that. And I do speaking engagements, which I love to do, and I really do like it.
The boy from Wisconsin now heading up a police department in Louisiana. Who knew?
Yeah, no kidding. It's not New Orleans, but I guess we could be considered the New Orleans metropolitan area, but it's night and day from New Orleans.
We're at the very, very end where I like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, you know what, Jerry, for anyone that has been in the FBI, I know some of the media stuff is not putting the FBI in the most positive light. I'm speaking from my own experience. You ever have a career where you think everything almost went perfect? That was my experience. I've never really been told no. I always had good vehicles. I always got to work the squads I wanted to be on. I had great people surrounding me. Chris Campion. I don't want to get in the name because I'm going to forget somebody because there's been so many over the years that have been so influential to me. I learned how to write a Title III from my wife. I don't like to admit that, but I did. She did several of those before I ever did one. I had great bosses along the way. Mike Anderson was one of our SACs, and I think he's done some of your podcasts, and Jeff Sillett and David Welker and Brian Vorndran, Mr. Williams, David. It's just been fantastic. I got to work gangs. I got to go to Saudi Arabia. I got to go to Guantanamo Bay. I got to do it all and have a family. Got 2 great kids. But the one thing for especially like the Harvey Hustlers, if you can build teams and rely on others and willing to share information and build coalitions with AUSAs, local prosecutors, sheriff's office, that Harvey Hustler case, if I didn't have an absolutely A-plus team, we're not having this conversation.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Todd Schliem and links to articles about the Harvey Hustlers and Murder Squad investigation and several case-related images, including a link to the Operation Clean House FBI website post and the chart of connected homicides and shootings. In the show notes, there are also links to other FBI Retired Case File Review episodes about violent drug gangs. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.